Welcome, everyone. On behalf of our faculty director, Professor Tariq Masood, thank you all for joining today's event with the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Julia Martin, Assistant Director of the Middle East Initiative. We're delighted to be hosting this conversation with James Snyder, MEI Senior Fellow, Chairman of the Jerusalem Foundation, and Director Emeritus of the Israel Museum, and today's guest, Manuel Rabate, Director of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Before I hand the event over to James, please be aware that the event is being recorded. While the event is on the record, please know that all attendees, including journalists, are prohibited from recording or distributing the event program in any capacity without prior written authorization. Thank you again for joining us. Over to you, James.
Julia, thank you for that kind introduction as always. Welcome to all of you. Good afternoon to those of you who are here in the US. Good evening to those of you who are in Europe and the Middle East and to the East. Those who are following this series might recall that last month we focused on interpreting the complexities of the Middle East through dance, a global medium. Today, we are going to look at the notion of the Universal Museum, which is a Western cultural idea. We're going to look at it from a Middle Eastern perspective. And we're going to do it through two iconic examples of that phenomenon in the Middle East, the Israel Museum, which is now 55 years old, and Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is just in its fourth year. And Manuel Rabate, who has been director of Louvre Abu Dhabi since it opened in 2017, is our very special guest and a good friend. And he and I will use the Israel Museum and Louvre Abu Dhabi, but we'll use them as a springboard for looking at a regional perspective on our subject. It's a great pleasure to have Manuel with us. Our paths intersected. This is a touching note. In 2018, our paths intersected at a gathering of international museum directors, just as Manuel had started his role as director at Louvre Abu Dhabi, and just as I was stepping down from mine as director of the Israel Museum. We met and connected immediately, and we felt almost immediately that we were losing an opportunity between us really to embrace across the Middle East from the very special and now very complex perspective of a universal museum. Today, however, is a kind of opportunity to revive that opportunity between us and to explore the way that the notion of the Universal Museum resonates between us, between those museums, and really all the more so across the landscapes of Jerusalem, in Israel, in the Middle East, and Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, in the Arabian Gulf. Now, before we begin, and really just to clarify, I'll speak for a moment about the distinction between terms, the notion of the encyclopedic museum, and now the more common notion of the Universal Museum. And I'm not doing this to be pedantic. I'm really doing this simply to help illuminate what our conversation is going to be about. The notion of the Universal Museum is really also related to emerging sensibilities in the complexities of our own times. To be very simple about it, historically, a Universal Museum, an encyclopedic museum, has been considered a museum that has examples of many cultures or even all cultures from all over the world, simply as examples of all of those narratives. The Universal Museum is more about taking those examples, but focusing on connectedness among cultures and across time. And the subject of the Universal Museum, frankly, becomes more and more relevant today because of the sensitive issues of grappling with the histories of imperialism and colonialism and notions of cultural appropriation. That is another talk that Manuel and I would be delighted to embrace and to share with you. That is not our talk for the moment. For the moment, we really want to focus on the notion of the Universal Museum through the particular lens of the Middle East. Some of you who've been following the series know that I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and somehow many years later, landed in Jerusalem and stayed there for a very long time. In a kind of nice parallel residence, Manuel is from provincial France and ended up in Abu Dhabi. We both really landed from other planets. I had the privilege of a long experience that way. Manuel is really just beginning in his formal role as director. And Manuel, to begin, why not just give us a little bit of your personal and professional trajectory and talk about what made you seize the moment of opportunity to be in Abu Dhabi in the way that you are.
Thank you so much, James, for the introduction. And maybe before starting, I would like to say that I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be with you. And I wanted to have a very, very strong and warm thank you to all the Middle East Initiative Harvard Kennedy School team. Incredible. We're exchanging with all of them, and I know that it's going to go smoothly thanks to the great work, thanks to Tarek Masoud also, whom I'm looking forward to meeting very soon, and indeed thanks to you, James, for triggering this first discussion. And I remember the excitement in 2018 when we met. We were just before the first anniversary of Louvre Abu Dhabi, as you mentioned. The museum opened in November 2017, and we were still we were even fresher. We're still quite fresh. If I give a few elements on my background, I was a literary student, let's say preparing for the normally on the grad school of literature in France, but I changed my path quite quickly to go to political sciences, sciences politique in Paris, and then I changed again. Instead of becoming a civil servant in France, I moved to business school, HEC, which is one of the best French business school open to the world. And again, instead of becoming a consultant or a banker, which was completely possible, most of my peers did, I started my career in the cultural field. I joined the Louvre in Paris. Now we need to precise the Louvre in Paris, of course, this incredible museum, which is the biggest and the most, before COVID, at least with the most visitors in the world. So I joined the Louvre team, and in a very specific role, which was quite interesting because I was working in the auditorium of the Louvre. So I was a deputy director of this. The Louvre has been reshaped a few decades ago by the incredible architect I.M. Pei, and part of the work of Pei was to design an auditorium, which is a beautiful space in which we had conferences, concerts, and of course also lectures. So I was within the performance side of the Louvre in Paris. I worked especially, now it makes sense, I worked on the program that would accompany the creation of the 8th department of the Louvre, which was created and which opened in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, which is a department of the Islamic art, which was a very strong statement for an encyclopedic, a universal museum, to reshape its structure and to create one full department. And so it made sense to have programs, concert, discussion, and talks to accompany that. I then joined the adventure of the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, which is this Jean Nouvel building, which opened in 2006, and which very close to the Eiffel Tower, which is dedicated to non-Western art. Very beautiful building, one of the last impressive museum to be developed in Paris, inside Paris, finding the place on the south of the Seine. And so I joined this museum to work on the exhibitions, on the program, on many things. 1 year before the opening, so I joined the team which was opening, and I stayed several years there, and then I had the opportunity, and this is what brought us together, to join Agence France Museum, which is still actually the body which was created between France and Abu Dhabi, to simplify, to organize, to coordinate all the French museums. There was a need to create a simple focal point, a body called Agence France Museums, to prepare the work and to accompany the creation of Louvre Abu Dhabi from the French point of view. And this is where you said, James, we landed somewhere else, and this was a catapult that put me in the system. So I've worked 13 years on the Louvre Abu Dhabi system, half of them as CFO and then as CEO of this agence. And then I moved to Abu Dhabi, still wearing my French hat, to build the joint team, which was necessary between, I say the French and the Emirati, but it's also people from all over the world, but it's like the union of the two countries and the two visions, and to make a single joint team. And then it became quite logical, and my name was proposed by the French, appointed by the Emirati, and I became the director, actually 1 year before the opening, which was quick and intense, in November. And here we are. We were very proud to have more than 2 million visitors in our second years, and we were going on, and of course the COVID situation has put sort of a stop, and we have closed for a while, reopened, and now the museum is open. So now I'm the director of a museum which proudly closed only 100 days, and which is open to the public in a very challenging environment, and trying to keep the boat afloat.
You know, I want to come back a little later in our conversation about the interesting path that you took. I mean, many of us in the field begin in the arts and humanities, often just come from art history, and our path takes us to leading a museum of the scale that you're now leading and that I led in Jerusalem. Yours is a bit different as a story because of your shift to political science and then coming back, which I'm sure has been beneficial to your trajectory thus far in Abu Dhabi. What I want to turn to, though, for a moment, is the origins of these two museums, again, as examples. I mean, for the Israel Museum is in Israel. This was the Holy Land, Palestine in more modern time, becoming the state of Israel, the place in the world that kind of captured the Western imagination in the middle of the 19th century, when religious pilgrims from the West started returning to the Holy Land, and their purpose in doing so was a kind of modern search for the origins of Western monotheism. As it happened conveniently in the middle of the 19th century, photography got invented. So suddenly images from that region of the world were going to the West, really igniting this enthusiasm for identifying with that part of the world and connecting it to the West. So there was, in a way, there was a logic for the modern state of Israel to want to emulate the Western model for creating an encyclopedic, or now a universal museum, and that would become the Israel Museum. I really would love for you to focus for a few minutes on what the impetus was for the UAE to create the Louvre Abu Dhabi, to kind of tell that story, and in a different way today there.
Yeah. I think that we need to see the Louvre Abu Dhabi within the broader master plan of the development of Abu Dhabi. So the UAE, United Arab Emirates, are composed of 7 emirates. So the biggest by the size, and the capital one is Abu Dhabi. So it's the capital city and the main emirates. You may know Dubai, Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, Fujairah, Umm Al Quwain. All of them are part of the union. The union was actually created 50 years ago, and we are celebrating this year the 50th birthday in 71. But little bit before, Sheikh Zayed, who was the visionary ruler of Abu Dhabi, who made the union of of the country, was already in '69 creating museums to keep the heritage and to collect the memories and move, let's say, from the collective object into museum modernity. And we are in this dynamism. This is when we look at the past. When we look at the future and in the master plan as the organization of the space and the vision, we are part of one of the islands of Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi is an archipelago. We have 47 islands, main one, which is of course where the main population is, but one just nearby called Saadiyat Island, the island of happiness in Arabic, is a place in which this cultural district is being developed with I can really talk about equipment, museum as equipment, as organization of space. We have our colleagues, our friends on your peers of New York University Abu Dhabi, which are also on this island. So it's about knowledge, education, culture, and so on. Louvre Abu Dhabi is the first museum which was born on this cultural district, but close to us, the Zayed National Museum, which is going to be the story of the nation, and the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi are also in almost walking distance, let's say. And this energetic part is in the development of the capital city, yes, structuring equipment. So the vision is there. The museum narrative are balanced also between what you want to tell. And you made a very interesting point, James, between encyclopedic and universal. And we will not drill too much today, but the encyclopedic museum in the West was this collecting of objects, collecting curiosity on the world, and this sort of exhaustive approach. For Abu Dhabi, we're really with a universal museum, the idea of indeed connectivity and so on. Abu Dhabi is a hub, is a place which was always connected to the neighbor, close neighbor, but also up to more than once I discovered the connection with Indian civilization and Indian zone, which is also very important in the Gulf. And all this connection, of course, with the West and with Africa. So we're really in this hub situation. So telling a new story of connection for Abu Dhabi in the growth and the development of the city made a lot of sense. I could develop a little bit also on the let's say the values of these young states, and one of the things which also is quite interesting is the idea of tolerance and hospitality and welcoming of all people of the world. We had a year dedicated to tolerance. The Pope went actually to Abu Dhabi. It was the first official visit. He was recently in Iraq. We know that this is very important, and very recently the Abrahamic agreement has been signed between the UAE and Israel, and close to us, and this is also part of the master plan, on the back of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and close to all these museums, you will have the Abrahamic house, which will gather a synagogue, a church, and a mosque. And this is part of my future immediate landscape on neighbor. So all these elements are consistent and are creating this, I would say, a development, transformation, evolution of the UAE and of Abu Dhabi.
You know, you're touching on a number of subjects that I want us to address one at a time. Before we do that, and I have to say at the start, it's a little dangerous to give two who come from the museum world the opportunity to show you images, but we felt that we should, and we'll do it quickly, just to show you a few images of the Israel Museum. Many of you, I hope and trust, already know it, and then to show more as well from the Louvre Abu Dhabi, which will be new to many of you. You know, again, for us in the Holy Land, it's a kind of natural narrative at the Israel Museum, anchored in the archaeology of the ancient land. We are talking about a story which is really about beginning with the first evidence of man reflecting on the nature of his own existence. And then you get on a kind of relentless highway that over the millennia takes you to the invention of monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the artistic expression, the artistic illustration of that entire story. Again, many of you know the Israel Museum, so you know that we cover 1.5 million years of narrative with a collection of 550,000 objects. These are not small numbers. And we'll just show a few images to illustrate what that's about. Here you see an image which I hope many of you know. It's the classic view of the east elevation against the setting sun at the summer solstice. It's a moment when I encourage all of you to try to have the opportunity to see this in real life. The next image, interestingly, takes us to the origins of the architecture, the site, the setting, the landscape of this place. Alfred Mansfeld, who was born in Russia, trained in Germany during the time of the Bauhaus, and who then came to Palestine in the 1930s and was among those who brought the vocabulary of international modernism to the Middle East. His idea was very simple. You see it in these images, starting at the top, taking a sketch of an Arab village on a Jerusalem hillside, reinterpreting it as modular modernism. And the image at the bottom shows the museum as it looked a few years after it opened. And actually, I have to say that what's great about this and this narrative of architectural history is that this is a rare example where the first idea, that first inspiration, actually became the reality. And in the next image, you see that reality today. It still preserves that image. It still preserves that inspiration. And again, it is the idea not just of a village on the hill, but of a kind of outcropping of the bedrock in a place where the architecture and the urban reality today are still built of the bedrock of where you are, which is something quite moving. Here you see the elegance of that notion. Mansfeld's idea was to do this in a kind of modular modernism so that over time, this Arab village on the hill, reinterpreted as a museum, could grow organically the way that a village might grow. In the next image, you see in this aerial view that that village became rather substantial, and it grew 10 times the scale of Mansfeld's original realization, but pursuant to to an inspiration that could grow to this scale. Mansfeld's architecture, of course, dominates the site. Also in the lower center, you see Frederick Keisler's Shrine of the Book, housing the Dead Sea Scrolls. To the right of the Shrine of the Book, you see Isamu Noguchi's 7-acre sculpture garden that tells the narrative of the modern Western sculptural tradition from the 19th century to the present. The power of all of this, of course, is that it's the intersection of a number of modernist voices planted on this hilltop in Jerusalem. As you enter the museum in the next image, you see and understand that the point of that international modernist vocabulary was simply to create a neutral backdrop for telling a cultural narrative that begins at the beginning of time and comes to the present. The image that you're looking at is the Cardo, the heart of the museum, from which you can experience this story through the archaeological narrative, through the narrative of the diaspora of the Jewish world, or through the narrative of the tradition of the fine arts. In the next image, you enter each of these three paths, each of these three collection wings, not with signage, but rather with objects that radiate the message from that story. Here you're looking at anthropoid sarcophagi from about 1500 BC, from the time when Egypt ruled in Canaan, in the ancient land of Israel, at a moment when those Canaanites adopted the Egyptian practice of mummification and burial in a sarcophagus. And of course, our message is about cross-culturalism as long ago as that moment in time. In the next image, you see the beginning of the narrative of the migration of the Jewish world from 2,500 years ago and then 2,000 years ago to the East and West worldwide. The message you see as you enter there is this notion of circularity, the notion of birth, marriage, death, and the continuation of that cycle generation after generation. In the next image, you see the entrance to the fine art wing of the museum. Of course, because we are in Israel, this museum begins with the narrative of 100 years of art in Israel. The figure that greets you as you enter is Yitzhak Danziger's depiction of Nimrod, the Canaanite idolater who would shock what would become the narrative of the evolution of monotheism. Here he stands as a kind of icon, and we'll come back to that notion of iconic imagery in a bit later in our conversation. In the next image, you see that this narrative of the fine arts unfolds in the museum pretty powerfully, so that when you get to classic modern art, really you have quite a strong holding, a remarkable anchor to find in that part of the world. In the next image, you see that we move from the Western tradition and drift. It's like the continental drift around the globe. So here you see Asian art. In the next image, you see Oceanic art. In the next, you see African art. And in the final, you see the art of the Americas. And actually, our image at the end is really the image of the beginning of that story, being a terracotta pre-Columbian god, who, of course, in some ways can resonate with Yitzhak Danziger's Nimrod. In our next image, we return to this iconic view of the museum. And I want to end with this image because it is the idea of how the architecture of any museum can anchor you to its landscape and can be about the story that you want to tell within. When we go from here to the Louvre Abu Dhabi, we are shifting to the Arabian Gulf. It's another kind of story. It's another kind of historical legacy. We're talking about new architecture, a newly developing collection. And I gave you the number of 550,000 objects at the Israel Museum. Manuel is going to talk about a collection which today is focusing on, I think, perhaps close to 1,000 objects in the collection and on loan. So, Manuel.
Thank you, James. It's beautiful. I love the sun on the colors. And maybe Eva, if you could, maybe I could do the. If you start by the first one, you're right, James. It's hard to talk about museum without sharing some images. So this is Louvre Abu Dhabi. This is no, please move to the next one. This is what I was talking about. This Saadiyat cultural district, and this is one of the latest rendering, in which you can see the Abrahamic house. So it's from the Abrahamic house point of view that you can see in the background the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And also the architect on your right to move to Jean Nouvel. Funny, we both put the drawing as a starting point, which shows that the architect, the genius architect, is start with a drawing always, and this is the first sketch by Jean Nouvet when he invented or dreamt this museum. Jean Nouvel is a French Pritzker Prize architect, and he had a long relationship with the Arab world. Part of his very important milestones encompass the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris. So he had a long reflection on lighting on the Arab world. He defined himself as a contextualized architect. So he's always working in the territory, in the place. The building will find its true nature. If you can move, Eva, to the next one, you will see. So the key element of this museum, which is positioned on the sea from four angles. So we are on the one of the side of this Saadiyat island. The museum is between the sea and the desert or semi-desertic, because the island was not populated before. Now it's part of the development, and you can see the bridge, which is in the background, which was created during the project. We used to come by boat, and I've seen this bridge, which is now one of the structuring elements of the relationship between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Take this bridge. After this bridge, you arrive to Dubai, and if you go the other way, you would go to the Corniche and to the old port of Abu Dhabi. So Jean Nouvel played with the codes of Middle East and with the dome, with this. So we have this metal dome, which is made of 8 layers of aluminium and stainless steel, which is actually only slightly protecting from the elements. So the sand, the rain, when it rains, can filter through this dome. But more important, and we'll see that in the next slide, it is the sun effect, which is coming. You can see also the access on the fact that he created a little city, a palace on the sea, a Medina, Arabic word for city, open to the sea. If you move to the next one, we will see, Eva, we will see what I was calling this. So there is what we call the rain of light effect, which is absolutely beautiful and very immersive, and the sun going through this delicate pattern of metal catches the dust, and we really have a sort of beam of light. And when you walk under the dome, there is not a microclimate, but a strong impact. So even in summer, and summer can be very hot in Abu Dhabi, under the dome there is a kind of breathing effect, and the experience, the sensation is fantastic, and you can see the projection of the light on the building, on these white buildings. In any, you mentioned the separation of the building and the way that the program of the building, we have a little bit the same approach, which is in very classical museums or palace transformed into a museum, or very huge building which have been turned into a museum or made as a museum. There is a distribution of the space within the same building. We both have this distribution of several buildings, which in our case are all connected. But each room or each building would be one room in the evolution. So you can also wander under the dome. Please, Eva, move to the next one. We can. So you have this sort of plaza. You can be disoriented. I would not say lost, but you can be. You can wander into the streets of Louvre Abu Dhabi. Move to the next one, please. You will see this is a work by Jenny Holzer, who tattooed on the walls of the museum artworks, text. This is Montaigne, and we are behind. We are on the street, so we can be under the dome or outside of the protection of the dome and just wander. Please, next. And you will see at night from the sea the lighting effect of the dome on the translucid approach of this sort of membrane. Next one. It's also from day. So we launched the classical architectural visit that you do, of course, working in a classical museum. We can do it by kayak, and you see that it is really Jean, who is a genius, really made it's a sculpture. It's an architecture piece, but it's indeed definitely a sculpture in a kinetic permanent evolution thanks to the sun. If we move to the narration, which is after, so let's go back inside. This is the first room. It's the Grand Vestibule introduction room, and this is a connection because we can see the dome from this room, and on the floor you see the map of the UAE, and except for the names of the Emirates, we have just thrown the names of origin of the collection. So you would see, you would read or decipher or not, but many names. And if you move to the next one, this is in this space. This is where we really tackle the universal question. And in the first introduction room, we are asking universal question, and by putting ensembles of 3 objects, we start to see, we try to, we ask questions, we don't have the answers, but we're trying to highlight the commonalities of mankind on how we share a lot. And this is the question of maternity, which can be throughout the ages, in the Middle Ages in Europe, ISIS, or in Africa, and to see how the artists can tackle this the same concept, even if they are not connected. If you move now, we'll move through, and this is what is very specific to us as a Universal Museum in Abu Dhabi, and a very new one is we could recreate this narrative and telling the story of humanity and the connection of humanity. So it works a little bit like a time machine. So instead of let's say classifying, and encyclopedic means it's work like an encyclopedia. You have entries and you organize the knowledge like that. We think it's very important to organize the knowledge, and we have the connection to that. But being a new museum, we can take the page of the encyclopedia and put them in an order that would accompany the visitors. And the order we chose is a chronology order. So, no, you're right. Sorry, but it moved like a time machine. We were in the first villagers with incredible loans from Jordan, the 2-head statues. We're moving to the kingdom, and in each room you would see in parallel artworks from the same epoch, not exactly the same, of course, not the same year, but from in resonance. So we have this Chinese dragon from the Wearing State. So before pre-empire, pre-Chinese empire, which is also close to Alexander the Great, onto the Greek and the Roman Empire as phenomenon appearing relatively at the same time in history, and to see another communalities, the development of organization and structuration of space. We have Teotihuacan. So you always walk through times, and you would see artworks from all civilization gathered with echo and sometimes chronological thematic approach in a specific showcase. If you move now, we are moving to this very important wing and galleries dedicated to the universal religion. And this was, I would say, in the recognized by the UAE during the Year of Tolerance as one of the, let's say, way of presenting in very respectful way the religious phenomenon on the discussion, on the echo we can make. So you walk here and you can see the Quran inscription from India. You could see a mihrab. You could see, if you move a little bit, you could see all the monotheism being presented, but also Hinduism and Buddhism and all the religious phenomenon in dialogue and very respectful, organized around thematics. So this one is about the symbol, and we have one about the light and the things that we have in common. We are a museum of objects, so it's not, the objects are not it's not a study on the religion phenomenon. It's a study, it's a presentation of the beautiful object of art, talking about of course religion. If you move to the next one, we have a specific room which is also dedicated, so it's a lot darker because of the fragility of the object, and this is dedicated to again a beautiful manuscript and text, and which shows them also because of their materiality. And you can see Torah, Bible, and the Quran, the three monotheism together. And we also have sacred text, some sutras also beyond the religion of the book, there are also other very important sacred texts, and we show them in full respect in this very touching touching room. People can be a little moved. If we move again, now we are getting back again on the global exchange, on the Silk Road from China through the Islamic world up to the West, and how the pattern of forms, how the ceramic works, how the exchange, and so on. We can see here the beautiful. It's one of our latest acquisition. Jain, so with minority in India, the Jain. It's a very beautiful and delicate object, which was just joined the Louvre Abu Dhabi story and the collection. If we keep on moving, sorry, I'm just so I'm trying to tempt you all to come, and we'll go, of course, we jumped a few, so the story accelerate. I will not go everywhere, but we're going to a certain definition of modernity, and we have this very great loan from Versailles. So the artworks are, half of them are coming from Louvre Abu Dhabi collection, so we have acquired them. Accession, we can rediscuss that, James, if you want after. But this is a process of growing the collection, and half of them, the other half, is coming from the French museums with an S, the Louvre, maybe the biggest lender, 1/3, and from all of them, including Versailles, Orsay, Pompidou, Guimet, Musée du Quai Branly, and so on. Move on, please. We will go to again, this one is part of the Louvre Abu Dhabi collection. Osman Bey, Turkish man, artist coming to Paris, learning Orientalism with the Orientalistic style, and coming back in his culture and using his skills to do this very beautiful painting, which is not an icon, or was not an icon when we acquired it, which now is one of the faces of Louvre Abu Dhabi, and this young Emir studying is a very fine artwork. If you go on in the time, we're in the 19th century, trying to show the modernity and the acceleration of time. You know, before the rooms on the wings were tackling thousands of years and centuries, and now we are in the acceleration, of course, of time, the invention of photography and what it means in the Western world. But we also wanted to show the simultaneity of the gaze of all the other people of the world, and the fact that they were living at the same time and having a creation at the same moment. Voilà. If you move on, we will go acceleration. So this one, sorry, it's a less. It's a good shot. I think we just integrated. We just installed the Chagall, which is on the left, 2 or 3 days ago. That's why the camera is a little different. So again, on the right, 2 artworks from the collection. On the right, Lam, Cuban artist, worked with a surrealist in Europe, and used his skill, and you see the identity. So it's completely an object, an artist of contact and mixed influence. And Chagall, Entre chien et loup, which is a beautiful painting, which Chagall started in Europe, in Paris, and finished it in the US. And it's also a shift and very, very beautiful and important artwork that we announced and offered to the public this week. Next one. Next one, and this is a room dedicated to the 20th century. So this one has changed already. Just to note, I said half. I was playing a little bit. So we have half of the artwork from the collection, half of the artwork from the French Museum, and also what we call regional loans. You've seen Jordan, Oman. We have Saudi loans, very important loans from the neighbor countries, but we also have the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which doesn't exist as a museum yet, but which already exists as a collection. And our colleagues in France lend us this great Basquiat that you can see on the left, and of course many loans from the Centre Pompidou. And if we move, I think I have two last slides. The last one is today's an artwork by Susanna Fritscher, which is an immersive, and it's a play again on the perfect connection, because after this room you will go back under the dome and you will experience the rain of light. And if we move to the last one, it's just the opportunity to say beyond this. So this is a permanent gallery, the permanent collection, which is actually semi-permanent because of its evolution. We also have a place dedicated to exhibitions and a children's museum, very active, in which we show real artworks, just at the size and with a gamification process to interact and to play fully our educational. I will not say no more. Please come and visit.
Manuel, thank you for that tour. You know, for me, it was very moving. You and I have done this before, but very moving for me to see these images and listen to you, because of course, there's such a resonance between what we worked to create in Jerusalem and what you are newly working to create in Abu Dhabi. And this would be another talk, but just to talk about our architectures. And, you know, Al Mansfeld and Jean Nouvel couldn't be more different in a way, but the way that each of them used this notion of, you know, the mashrabiyah, the screening wall that filtered the light of the Middle East from the space that you're in. Our interpretation in Jerusalem is different, but it was a very important element. And the notion of how you use water. Okay, we've never done kayaks in Jerusalem, but the way that water fits into the narrative is very important, and it's a resonance. You know, a second small thing I wanted to ask, when I mentioned showing images from the Israel Museum, that Danziger's Nimrod is a kind of icon there, and of course at the Louvre it's the winged victory as you go up the grand staircase. Perhaps it's early for you, but you mentioned in passing the painting that is a kind of icon for you. Do you feel that you're already developing an icon for Louvre Abu Dhabi, or it's too early?
I think I think there are always more than one icon in the Louvre. I remember the old was the three ladies that are giving a meaning to our lives. Was the internal jokes. So the La Joconde, the Winged Victory, on the Venus of Milo, were the three ladies, the soul of the Louvre, and in a way structuring also the space within the palace. For Louvre Abu Dhabi, I insisted on the Emir reading because it has become, we acquired it quite early, and it was one of the images that we used in the pre-opening phase to make as you saw for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, a museum which doesn't exist as a place yet, can you can have exhibition talks, you make the things, you prepare the existence, and this artworks was very powerful for that. But we have also artworks which we have acquired, which became, we have a great Bactrian princess, beautiful little statues, which is one of the highlights of the collection and one of my favorite. It was already a very important artwork when we acquired it, but now it is integrated into this universal narrative, so maybe even stronger. I think we need a little bit more time to see which one will become, will structure, which one will be impossible, because on icon you cannot move. It has to be there, and we also started some exchanges, and the collection has been, some of the artworks of the collection. You've seen the Kaibot, for instance. Yes. Which is a very cinematic. So this one was already a very important painting, very well known, and we have it was part of the Kaibot exhibition in the US several years ago, and we are very happy that it participates to the life and the knowledge on Kaibot. So we'll see.
You know, and it's fair. You're only in your 4th year. You can take time. You know,
it's 1 year of COVID. Already 1 year of COVID, which I don't know how to count, but for a museum whose mission is to, as you and I know, but to share, the purpose of the museum is to preserve and to protect this these artworks and to offer them to the public. So if you take one of the two missions, the two fundamental missions, we protect, we are the custodian of the artwork for sure, but we are missing the outreach, the education, the knowledge, and this is, I wouldn't count fully, not at least fully there.
Right.
At
And
least 100
actually,
years.
what you're saying now takes us to where I want to go next, coming toward the conclusion of our conversation together. But before that, I want to say something. Listening to you, I realize that for each of us, each of us an outsider landing from another planet, but coming from different places, a resonance that is consistent between us is this notion that our goal is to present and to explore the power of beauty, and to do it through cultural connectedness and human connectedness, which is more timely at the moment, emerging as we hope we are from COVID, than it might have been even a few years ago. And, you know, for me, arriving in Jerusalem, I'm a modernist art historian. The revelation for me was, oh my God, there's 1.5 million years of stuff that informed the invention of modernism. For you, coming from the sociology of culture and going from France farther to the East, give us a comment on that. You know, what surprised you? What was the epiphany when you arrived, as you were just beginning this sort of privilege of orchestrating a narrative like this?
It was the energy of the place and the agility of the UAE in this transformative moment, and it's absolutely fascinating to see the embracing the modernity with the strategical and the bet on culture. When I'm all my life in museums, so I'm of course a museum animal, but I was very interested by the curiosity of the Emirati and of people coming from all over the world working in the museum. It's not obvious in France, the transformation, the role of the museum in the transformation is on a very slow pace. I mentioned Musée du Quai Branly. It's maybe the last time we could really put this kind of equipment within the capital city. So seeing a country which is embracing modernity, opening to the world at this pace and with this efficiency, it's quite stimulating. We are participating, so the Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is part of the Department of Culture and Tourism. So I'm at the same time serving the idea of developing culture and education, and at the same time the attractivity of the city, which is also very necessary in the development of the region and the attractivity of the country. And seeing that we were in a way changing the society or participating to a change of the society, which is very well organized and transformed, but at the same time also creating a new generation of Emirati specialists of museums. Half of our staff, so we have very international staff, but half of the staff is Emirati and very promising. So there are new sort of new typology of curators which are born with us, and adaptation of job for this kind of museum structure. Our security manager is a former police officer, Emirati, who was trained in France. He's seen all the museums. He come back and he speaks both languages. And this transformative approach is actually very stimulating and I would say aspirational. So in the galleries, the beauty of the artworks and the connectivity is aspirational, and the role of the museum, the civic role of the museum, is also aspirational. And this is, voilà, my epiphany, a double aspiration.
And actually, you're taking me to what might be the most critical and enlightening question, which you and I have discussed in the past. You know, we have the privilege of creating these narratives in places where museums are not part of the history. and that's exciting. But the second point, and equally important, if not more so, is who are we serving and how are we serving them? And your local audience is quite different from the audience in Jerusalem, and certainly from the audiences in encyclopedic and universal museums across the Western world. And who are the tourists that come to visit us? Even though we are both in the Middle East, but in Jerusalem, you're looking always to the West. So it is a Western-centric culture with respect to what a museum is about, but yours is more Eastern-centric. It's very different in that respect.
Absolutely. The agreement, the text which founded the Louvre Abu Dhabi says between East and West. And this is really the positioning of Abu Dhabi. For me, everything comes with the names. There was I spent years saying this is not we are not a branch of the Louvre. This is Abu Dhabi developed project, and from the West you would see the Louvre plus a name, but actually it's a meeting point. When you give the name of the capital city to a museum and you put it close to the most important encyclopedic or universal museum, and this is the marriage between both. This is what gives the ambition of the place and the museum. So I would say, you rightfully say there is the tourists coming to visit, and before COVID it was 70%. On our tourists were actually two main segments, if we speak like that, are coming from China and from India. The two biggest blocks of visitors, people living in the UAE or visiting the UAE. 1/3 was Western, but all the nationalities. But you can see this sort of, which is absolutely not the sociology of the Universal Museum in the West. And the local audience, which represented 30%, Emirati and the 190 nationalities, which are or 200, which are living in the UAE, were 30%, with a lot of school, a lot of education and community. So today, this is almost the only base we have, and they go a little bit further even in the appropriation, in the ownership of the museum, which is also the relationship. What does it mean? What does it mean the museum for the people living here? What is the relationship between the museum and its environment, territory?
It's a point that will be very interesting to watch as your narrative continues to evolve. In Jerusalem, you think you're at the point where East meets West, or historically, it is always said you're at the center of the universe. Really, where you are is where Europe meets Asia and Africa. And where you are is different. You really are exactly where East meets West, because you're delivering a story that has a Western weighting in some respects, but for an audience, for students, for a local audience, and for a touring audience that really comes from the Eastern half of the world as much as from the West, and probably far more so.
Absolutely. And indeed, we will, the life of an institution define also what we do, and the exhibitions we will have, the seminal work, the publication, and this is where the footprint of the museum will explain where we go. We have opened many doors, many questions. I said at the beginning, so it's this connected history of art is fascinating, because you can work on many and counterpoint, many transversalities and so on. But now the next move after COVID, we need to recover it a bit. But the rollout when we're back to something closer to reality will be to go further into the research, further into the education, and to see what this concept means, and working with, of course, having collaboration and partnerships with museums all over the world. We felt a huge solidarity between the museums during COVID, because everybody rejoicing each time a museum was reopening or exchanging best practices. the loans, people becoming the custodian of artworks. They were supposed to give back, but they couldn't travel. And I think the community of museums and the shared mission towards the public is also the next step we want to reactivate.
You know, you spoke just now of collaboration, which really brings us to the last point that I wanted to cover, and I think it's almost time for us to close. First, when you were showing your images and you got to contemporary art, it's obvious that contemporary art can and will be a bridge for you to be able to collaborate globally. And how do you see that role in contemporary art developing for you? And of course, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is taking shape next door, not yet physically, but the collection is growing. So there will be another museum nearby that will be participating on that front.
Yeah, you summarized exactly it's absolutely modern and contemporary is part of our stories and narrative. There is not a stop, like the last room of Louvre Abu Dhabi is not the Guggenheim. We're working, of course, seamlessly and so on. The contemporary creation on working with artists is definitely something very important. We started when we opened. We had a project called Collab, in which we had 4 UAE-based artists, 2 Emirati, 2 non-Emirati, working with French manufacturers who made artworks inspired by the collection or by glimpse of what they had seen. And that was one of the experimental way of inviting modern contemporary art and so on. We have commissions. You've seen Jenny Holzer, but also the trees by Pennone. So it's part of our DNA to play with contemporary art. The question is how with our narrative. So we don't say a million. We have 12,000 years of history, because we start. I would say with Neolithic and a little bit later. So we are maybe on a shorter period, still quite long. So when you want to tell the story in a few hundred objects, we cannot explore all the new. We would love to, but so we can do experimentation. But it's really the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi that will have the capacity on the volume to explore extensively the new Middle East production and the global south. That's going to be the mandate of our neighbor. So what will make sense as contemporary within our museum is what is connected to this narrative, what is story of connection, what is story of story of stories, actually, because we are telling stories.
Exactly. And you know, I want to close not so much with a question, but a comment. We in our world have the privilege of being engaged in cultural diplomacy. In recent time, we've seen beneficial political diplomacy with the Abraham Accords. That is political diplomacy, but it has opened the door for a lot of collaboration. And I want to say here that it's been great for Manuel and me, because we've got several ideas percolating now that can be between Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem, and then across the landscapes of both of those places. And it's something very exciting for us. I don't know if you want to say something on that, which will be the conclusion of our wonderful conversation today.
I know we need to progress completely, but it's really happening, and I think it starts in the museum world. It always starts by a human connection and people meeting each other, which was a challenge during the COVID, but or a challenge or a facilitation. But I think from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, we know that there are institutions which are important, and we already have established a strong discussion points. So I'm out of courtesy, we need to close a few clauses before we can announce formally. But I think there are really a common interest and excitement between the.
For everyone who's with us, we've concluded nothing. We use the term percolating, and percolation is very exciting on this front, because it really wasn't possible in this way before, and it's quite exciting. So with that, I think it's time for us to conclude. Manuel, it's great to see you. I wish we were seeing you in person. We actually have plans to try to accomplish that
Please,
once
please.
we get out of the darkness into the light after COVID. And thank you very much for being with us today. And we thank all of you for joining us. We hope you found this conversation to be enlightening and energizing in the same way that we did. Thank you all.
Thank you, James. Thanks to the full team of the Middle Eastern Institute again and initiative. And please, we are in contact, so don't hesitate to come and visit. It will be a pleasure to welcome you. Have a good day. For me, it's evening, but
yes,
good
enjoy
to have
your
been with you. Absolutely. Bye-bye. Massalama.